Thanks for everyone for being here. And wow, kudos to Mark and Robert for just an amazing slam on philosophy. I could have listened to that, frankly, all morning. Well, what an amazing moment we're living through, really. For anybody who's interested in how organizations work, it's been just a moment of incredible, intense learning. And that's quite interesting, the things that I think leaders in our organizations have learned. They've learned how important it is to look after people and to show that you care about them. They've learned that if you trust your people, they trust you more in return. And we've discovered, which some of us sort of knew, that working from home was not a charter for slackers. It does really work. This is big learning. But what's, I think, so extraordinary is we could have done this experiment, this whole shift in working patterns. We could have done this experiment 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But somehow we needed necessity to be the mother of invention for us. So now, of course, the question everybody's asking is, well, what happens next, right? Everybody in the world seems to be talking about the future of work. And I'm kind of more interested right now in the presence of work. What is happening now in these organizations? Now they've had this explosive, intense experience of change. What's going on now? And what I see is that companies have sort of divided into two reactions or behaviors. The first group has, after this moment of quite radical change, decided to become more radical, to become more ambitious, and to do more experiments. They aren't waiting. Having experienced change, they've really gotten a taste for it. So I'm interested in organizations like a collecting society for artists that is now, instead of just doing its routine work, intervening at kind of each piece of the ecosystem to provide support and technology and global connections to ensure that artists get paid for their work, not just in a crisis, but forever, and have their rights protected. And they're building a whole coalition for other collecting societies in other arts to develop long-term protection for all of them. It is a huge, breathtaking, positive contribution. Or I can look at companies like water utilities, who for the first time ever are working together as a network to provide better service, to share experience, and to share expertise. Or I'm looking at companies like a music company called Dice, which has built a platform so that musicians can actually earn a living from paid, exclusive live events. And I'm working with companies like retailers who suddenly finding themselves with quite a lot of empty space on their hands. Instead of just thinking, how do we get rid of it? They're thinking, actually, how do we use this asset and our core capabilities to turn this space into something that's really useful for society, that's really needed right now? How might we use this moment of uncertainty to become more valuable and more useful to the society that we serve? These are big, ambitious questions, provoking big, ambitious experiments. And what I think is so interesting about this group of companies is that they're more energetic, they're more future-focused, and therefore they're very much more creative, and they're doing a lot more experimentation. It's as if, having done this huge explosive experiment at the beginning of lockdown, they've now really got a taste for it, and they don't want to stop. They want to go further, and they want to go faster, and they see in this moment of profound change a gigantic opportunity to do more, better for more people. Now, There's also the second group of companies, and they're okay. They're kind of heaving a sigh of relief. They did the big work from home experiment. It turned out it was okay. It turned out that their intuition, that you have to look after people and trust them more and devolve decision-making to a local level, that all worked. And they're kind of glad that it's over. And now what they're doing is they're waiting essentially for the return of business as usual. I think they're a little homesick for the way that things used to be. And what they can't see or they won't see or they don't want to see is that the old status quo, the business as usual, is gone. Because we live now in an age of crisis, right? We know we're going into an economic crisis, an employment crisis. We're already in a crisis of inequality, and we're already up to our necks in a climate crisis. And yet somehow they have this lingering nostalgia for going back to something where that crisis, those crises weren't there, but they are there. And I've been thinking really hard about, well, why is it that they won't see this, can't see this, aren't prepared to do more change in order to become more adaptive to this period of crisis? And I think part of the problem is that ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've developed this notion of management, which is really a sort of three-legged stool: forecast, plan, execute. You do the forecast and you do this punctilious plan, you measure everything that moves, and you execute magnificently. And let's be clear, that got us a very long way for a very long time. It made us feel safe, and it gave us a sense of being in control. And we got very, very addicted to that sense of certainty, to our ability to forecast, to our ability to measure and control everything around us that mattered. But today we're in a really different place. The experts in forecasting say that at the very best, if you're really open-minded and rigorous and consult a gigantic range of sources, constantly update your forecasts and assign probabilities to them, if you do all that, then maybe the furthest you can see out with accuracy is 400 days. 400 days. If, like the rest of us, you're not that rigorous, you're not that comfortable with probabilities, then probably the furthest you can see with any accuracy is 150 days. And that doesn't mean you've got rid of uncertainty. It just means you've got a little bit less of it. So this is a very different space. It's a very subtle shift that we've gone through over the last 30, 40 years, which has made our world increasingly unpredictable, and therefore has made that three-legged stool of forecast, plan, execute distinctly wobbly. We're starting to understand just how unpredictable the world really is. And that world, the world we inhabit now, needs something much more flexible, much more malleable, much more responsive. We need the capacity to explore, to experiment, to discover what works today, what's relevant today, what's here today that wasn't there yesterday. And I think that that shift from a predictable world, forecastable world, to an unpredictable one is profound, and it's subtle, and there's no going back, and we need to pay attention to it. Because either we ignore it and we keep wondering why this three-legged stool is so uncomfortable, or we do as these bolder businesses are doing, and we accept a whole new mindset, which is a world of experimentation, driven by a myriad of voices, where status doesn't come from titles or even necessarily experience, where respect comes, just as it does in rehearsal rooms and studios and labs, from simply having the best idea. Can we do that? Can we make that shift? I think we are seeing, we have the capability, we have the creativity and the imagination we need to navigate the rapids of uncertainty. But have we forgotten how to use them? Are we too afraid of uncertainty to explore, to experiment, and to invent? I don't know. Changing habits is hard. The political scientist Robert Putnam did a study after 9/11 in the United States, and he showed that after that crisis, social capital, those norms of generosity, reciprocity, and trust, they just shot up. It was measurable how different people felt towards each other and behaved towards each other. But here's the challenge. That difference lasted for 6 months. And after 6 months, measurable levels of social capital were right back where they'd been before the tragedy. Are we going to use this crisis to change fundamentally how we work together, the capacity that we have to invent and to explore and to experiment? Or are we going to return as fast as possible to business as usual and keep trying to force fit a predictable model of leadership and management onto a world that simply won't behave? I think if we revert to the norm, we revert to what we've seen, we stay stuck with anachronistic tools and ways of thinking that exacerbate the problems we're trying to solve right now. But will we make that transition? I don't know. I don't believe in prediction. What I do know is that we're at a crossroads. We can stick to an old model, forecasting, planning, executing, measuring instead of talking, more focused on numbers than on people. But we don't have to. We've just been through a huge experiment and seen that we can do more and seen that we can do better. And really, the choice is ours now. Thank you.
Amazing, Margaret. Thank you very much for that. I can't take away enough brilliance from the pieces you talked about. Reciprocity obviously has been a common theme. It may become the new unprecedented of the moment in terms of what we need. But the bit I took away was around the energetic future focus that needed to happen with companies, working with the likes of Rosaline Blair, amazing chairperson of Alexander Mann Solutions, who has always said about, don't worry about today, it's where we're going to. Let's build that plan for the future. Or businesses like Rate My Placement, who I've worked with, and Ollie Sidwell and his team, that next stage of helping people. And I suppose my first question, if you'll permit me, would be, what do you see as the biggest things holding back companies from the levels of experimentation and imagination that you described in your so eloquent speech?
Well, I think the real problem I see is that we've been sold, I think, a kind of nursery fable about change. And the fable is that you can have lots of change, but you don't have to give up anything. And I think this is particularly obvious to me in the area of diversity, which is we've been told, yes, we'll get women into the workplace and they'll have equal opportunity and it's fine, nothing will change. It's just there'll be women there, right? Which kind of overlooks the fact that, well, women aren't necessarily going to be present and have no impact. So there is going to be change, which means some behaviors and norms are going to stay, but others are going to have to go. And I think we've seen exactly the same thing in terms of Black Lives Matter and the whole issue of ethnic diversity, which is, yes, people accept in principle we want a more diverse workforce. Some people even accept in principle that this leads to better decision making. But nobody wants to give up their spot. And if you have a board, for example, with 12 people on it, and traditionally these have been 12 white men, if you're going to have a diverse board that looks like the society you serve, then some of those people who think those are their seats are not going to get them.
Oh,
And nobody likes to talk about this, right?
no,
Nobody wants to say there's a cost.
correct.
But you don't get change without sacrifice. And when I hear people saying, we're going to have a transformation program, we're going to have a D&I program, and nobody's going to get hurt, I think, oh, hang on a second. Nobody went storming over to the beaches of D-Day saying it's going to be all fun, enjoy
stay the same.
Trip, right? Nobody said this. And I'm not saying that it isn't worth it. Of course, I think it's worth it. And I'm not saying that by the time this huge period of transition has taken place, it won't be better. I passionately believe it will be better. But in the interim, we are asking people to make some sacrifice. And if we don't call it that, how can we honor it? And how can we thank people for stepping aside in order that their successor, for example, not look like them? That, I think, is what nobody wants to talk about. But I think we've got to talk about it. Because if you just take that one thing and said, okay, everybody appointing their successor, they have to appoint someone who isn't like them. Think how much you would advance the cause of diversity in a short period of time. We've got to start doing these experiments and stop talking about theory and get into action if we're going to maintain any kind of credibility as leaders.
But Margaret, I think what you're talking to there really, really strongly is the fragility element for individuals. And that, as a human response, you want to protect yourself because you don't want to be exposed or be vulnerable, whether it's you have hired somebody who came from the same university of you, or who has the same share or love of rugby, for example, whatever that may be. So how do we empower people, whether they're leaders or those who are trying to manage up, to deal with that fragility?
Well, I think we have to look at a couple of things. I think we have to see that actually doing this is how we all learn. And doing this is how we participate in change, as opposed to sitting back and hoping we aren't just its victims. I think the question here is, do you want to be passive and hope that somehow, it flows over you? Or do you want to be do you want to be an active part of this change and actually start to create the world that you say you want? And, it reminds me of someone I used to share an office with years and years ago, who once said to me, the only reason I'm still here is because when they came to do layoffs, I wasn't around and they just forgot I existed. And I think he was telling the truth, to be honest. But I thought, is this the height of our ambition, that we hope nobody will notice us and the change will happen, and then we'll put our head up, above the parapet again and say, oh, yay, I'm still here? Or do we actually want to be participants in the change in the world that we inhabit?
And that's the opportunity, I suppose, that's there for all of us to engage in. I think a big part of the change that's coming around the corner, as well as on a societal level and an intellectual level, is around technology. Technology has obviously accelerated lots of the change that we're seeing. I think the experiment, as you articulate it, of this time has allowed us to test and try out technology. And look, we're a living example of that. I had to go and run and step up my jacket game to match yours, but we were able to do that because of the technology that was there, right? But essentially, tech is changing us rapidly. Artificial intelligence, automation of processes, etc. For you, do you see that change through technology as a positive or a negative?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, but I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I was very impressed by the clothes change. Very impressed. That's the first thing, the most important thing, right? The second thing I would say is, there's been this whole overblown rhetoric around the fourth industrial revolution, and the whole gist of it was it's technology that's going to change everything. Oh, and by the way, the technology is inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it except kind of understand it and give in gracefully.
Yep.
And I think actually this has been a complete distraction. because I think the much more fundamental change is the unpredictability in the world. And I think a huge amount of technology is based on the assumption that there are a lot of predictable patterns which technology can deal with very well.
Yep.
And I think the truth is, in some areas that's true, and in many, many areas it absolutely is not true. So there's an awful lot of propaganda out there about what AI can do and what technology and automation can do. It can do some stuff brilliantly, stuff that's complicated, repeatable, and drudgery, it handles magnificently. Creativity, invention, absolutely not. And there's a third piece, which is that when we outsource work to technology, we are essentially losing the capacity to do that work ourselves. I've outsourced to my phone the task of knowing my kids' phone numbers. Right?
Yes.
It used to be inconceivable. You didn't know your kids' phone numbers.
It's in your head. That's right.
Your head was full of all the phone numbers. Right? I can't do that anymore. I have the faintest idea what my kids' phone numbers are.
It's so true.
I am fine with that. I am not fine with outsourcing judgment and judgment to technology. And I'm not fine with losing the capacity to have conversations with people because the technology is doing this for me.
Yep.
And I've sat with tech companies who are inventing the technology so that instead of having a conversation, it can just tell me what to say and I'll just read it from a screen. And I don't actually really have to interact because the AI is doing the interaction for me. This, I think, is really dangerous, not just because it feels ugly, but because actually, if I lose the capacity to have a conversation with you on my own steam without cues, I lose the capacity to think for myself. And as I lose the capacity to think for myself, I lose the capacity to be creative, to be imaginative, and to invent things that haven't happened before.
Yes.
And I think, we think it's impossible to imagine that. But I'm very struck by the degree to which in lockdown, I noticed, my sister, for example, who lives on her own, lost the habit of eye contact, right? This is psychologically really important. You change people's habits, you lose skills quite fast. So I think technology is a sub-story. I don't think it's the main story.
Yep.
I think the main story is how do we retain confidence in our creativity and our imagination and not be persuaded by the salesman of Silicon Valley that, oh no, they can take care of all of this stuff for us. The Bach written by machines is just as good as real Bach. This is nonsense. And how do we, instead of implementing all these apps that will tell us how happy our employees are, why don't we become better at talking to them?
Yeah. And the simplicity of it is why I laugh, because you constantly are bombarded with outsourcing elements to make things more efficient, etc. When actually sometimes the most efficient thing is just picking up yourself and walking across the 2 meters where the desk is in the old days, or picking up easier now the phone to have the conversation with someone to say, how are you? We're running out of time. We've got so many questions for you, Margaret. I suppose the last one I want to give to you. What is your lasting thoughts with 50 seconds left that you want to leave this audience with?
Don't lose confidence in your imagination. Don't be persuaded that if you just follow the rules and you become super efficient, everything will be okay. Efficiency is only effective in situations where everything's predictable and you know what you're being efficient for. But in an age of uncertainty, efficiency erodes your capacity to respond. It erodes your margins for surprise and the unexpected. And this is what human beings are brilliant at. So don't trade security for thinking.
Beautiful. Margaret, thank you. The virtual round of applause is coming in. People are obviously acknowledging the greatness of what you've shared with us today on the chat. There's loads of questions that people wanted to throw you. I think we deserve another session, just you on your own. And I'm sure Jim will facilitate that in one of the outpours. But listen, in addition to making the grade of quality of shirts and jackets increase on our talk, you've raised the level of awareness of what we can do as organizations, as leaders, around making sure we haven't put our heads in the sand and that we can go through in that uncharted space optimistic rather than being blind. Please check out Margaret's book on all good stores. It was out in March. Download it. It will be on my bookshelves. Margaret, thank you so very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
Take care.